Pay close attention from this moment on, because this is going to change your life. If insecurity has always been lurking, in your relationships, at work, in your choices, and even when you look at yourself, this video will show you where it truly comes from, how it infiltrates your body and your thoughts, how it distorts what you feel, turns calm into threat, creates dark futures in your mind, fuels the fear of being abandoned, reinforces the feeling of not being enough, traps you in comparison, and makes you depend on other people's validation to exist. You weren't born this way. You were shaped by a distorted model called trauma, and understanding this is the first step to taking away the anguish and fear that insecurity has held over your life until now. If that made you breathe a little deeper, it's because it touched something you felt many times, but never knew how to explain. Emotional insecurity doesn't appear out of nowhere. It forms in silence, between the lines of childhood, in moments when you realized, even without understanding, that you needed to earn affection, attention, or respect. Gabor Maté explains that the body records these experiences as if they were permanent instructions. Bowlby observed that when the bond was unstable, the child grew up learning to doubt themselves. You didn't choose to feel this way. You simply adapted to survive. And that adaptation extends into your adult life. That's why tiny details destabilize you. That's why you fear losing people, even when they show no intention of leaving. That's why the feeling of inadequacy appears, even on good days. Not because you're fragile, but because no one ever taught you. That fear can also be born inside calm homes. Maté shows that what the child doesn't understand, the adult carries in the body. And, without realizing it, you grew up trying to avoid an old pain that was never healed, only hidden. But here is something important. If you can recognize parts of this pattern, it means something inside you is already awakening. It's not weakness, it's awareness. And awareness is always the beginning of transformation, because when you understand why you react the way you do, something stops controlling you. You start breathing differently, seeing yourself differently, realizing it was never your fault to feel this much. That's why this video matters. Here, step by step, you'll understand how emotional insecurity forms, how it occupies the body, how it shapes the mind, how it sabotages relationships, how it weighs on your daily life, and how to begin dismantling this pattern in practice. You will discover that there is a real path, not fast, not miraculous, but real, to build inner safety and healthier emotional bonds. And if you stay until the end, you'll realize that insecurity was never about weakness, but about a story you didn't know you were living. And today, for the first time, you're going to see this story from the inside. Emotional insecurity usually begins long before adulthood, when the child tries to understand what they must do to be accepted. Gabor Maté explains that human beings, at birth, depend not only on physical care, but mainly on stable emotional bonding. When that bond is unstable, the child forms the idea that their worth depends on their behavior, and this becomes low self-esteem very early. Small comparisons, harsh criticism, and conditional affection leave subtle but deep marks. Bowlby reinforced this by noting that inconsistent attachment created an internal pattern of alertness. As a result, the child learns to doubt themselves, and this pattern becomes insecurity in relationships and in adult life. A person who grew up like this tends to interpret every situation as a test of worth. Maté notes that when affection depends on performance, the child learns to hide parts of themselves so as not to lose connection. Later, this becomes a search for validation and a constant sense of inadequacy. Even when everything seems fine, questions appear, both conscious and unconscious. Why do I feel so insecure, even when things are okay? Will they abandon me if I make a mistake? This doubt does not come from weakness. It comes from childhood trauma that remains active in adulthood. And the worst part is that the more the person tries to please others, to feel safe, the further they drift from themselves. The formation of attachment style also plays a decisive role. Bowlby described anxious attachment as appearing when the child never knew what reaction to expect. One day they received affection, the next day distance, and this irregularity created emotional anxiety. Maté states that the emotional system stores this inconsistency as a threat, even years later. This is why, in adulthood, any change in tone or expression can feel like rejection. The person develops constant comparison, self-criticism, and fear of abandonment. Without realizing, these reactions come from the inner child, who never felt good enough. Many people think emotional insecurity is exaggeration, drama, or neediness. But this is a misconception. Those who grew up hearing criticism or receiving little emotional support develop emotional perfectionism as a way to avoid failure. Fear of rejection becomes a reflex, and the search for validation becomes a silent routine. Maté explains that the emotional brain records these patterns as survival strategies, not conscious choices. That's why even in stable relationships, someone may feel anxious attachment, fear of making mistakes, and doubt about their own worth. None of this appears out of nowhere. It originates in experiences that were never understood. Deep down, everyone who carries insecurity seeks the same thing: confirmation that they are lovable, without needing to be perfect. The inner child longs for predictability, care, and emotional stability, something they may not have received. And the adult tries to compensate by chasing external safety, without realizing the emptiness comes from within. This is the moment when a person begins asking if there is a way to understand their own body and mind. And that question opens the path to something deeper. Emotional insecurity is born first in the body, long before it finds words. Gabor Maté explains that when a child grows up in environments where affection is inconsistent, the body learns to shrink to avoid being surprised by pain. This shrinking becomes a pattern: tense muscles, short breathing, an internal state that always feels prepared for something unpleasant. It's not a choice, it's physiological memory. And this memory shows up without permission. A person simply realizes they live on alert, even when everyone around them is calm. Over time, this fear-trained body begins to influence the mind. It doesn't take much: a change in expression, a different tone, a small delay, and the heart reacts first. The mind comes later, trying to understand why it feels threatened, when, rationally, nothing explains it. Maté notes that the body stores these old learnings as if they were survival instructions. That's why restless thoughts appear in ordinary moments, creating emotional anxiety that seems to have no origin, and the person wonders why they feel so much, even when everything seems fine. This pattern also shapes how a person seeks safety in relationships. When someone grew up without predictability, the impulse to look for constant signs of approval doesn't come from vanity, but from necessity. John Bowlby observed that children who must guess the caregiver's mood learn to monitor everything around them. In adulthood, this monitoring becomes constant comparison, fear of making mistakes, and a persistent feeling of inadequacy. It's as if the person is always trying to figure out whether they deserve to stay, even when no one is asking that of them. And when the body lives in this state, small situations gain enormous emotional weight. A slight change in dynamics feels like distance. A shorter reply feels like disapproval. A longer gap between messages creates the impression that something is falling apart. Maté explains that these reactions are echoes of the past, not exaggerations. The organism is simply trying to protect you from the kind of pain that was once too big to understand. And without realizing it, the adult starts interpreting small details as signs of danger, even when danger isn't there. In the end, someone who lives like this desires something very simple: peace. Peace to finally trust their own rhythm. Peace to not have to decode everything. Peace to feel they can exist without constant vigilance. The person wants to breathe without fear. And when they begin to understand how the body and mind work together in this pattern, a new awareness appears, an awareness that opens the path to look at the place where insecurity hurts the most: relationships. Emotional insecurity often reveals itself most intensely, exactly where someone wants most to get things right. In relationships, Gabor Maté explains that when someone carries childhood wounds and unrecognized emotional trauma, any intimate bond activates old layers of emotional memory. Suddenly, the heart reacts as if loving were too dangerous. The fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection, and that hard-to-explain feeling appear, as if the other person might give up at any moment. It doesn't matter how stable the relationship is. The mind tries to protect itself by anticipating loss, and the person begins to wonder why they fear losing someone, even when there is no real reason. This pattern produces behaviors that slowly wear down the relationship without the person realizing it. Jealousy appears not as distrust, but as a plea for safety. Vigilance emerges not as conscious control, but as a desperate attempt to avoid pain. Maté notes that the body stores the old logic of "I need to protect myself," and this shows up as constant comparison, self-sabotage, and anxious attachment. John Bowlby observed that when a child learns the bond might fail, they grow up trying to predict any sign of distance. In adulthood, this becomes distorted interpretation. Every silence feels like withdrawal. Every pause feels like a shift. Every detail becomes a threat. This fear makes the person test the bond without meaning to. Small provocations, subtle questions, to attempts to measure how willing the other person is to stay. It's not manipulation. It's emotional insecurity, trying to feel safe. The person thinks, what if I'm being replaced? What if I'm not enough? What if they get tired of me? These questions come from childhood wounds that were never healed. And while trying to obtain guarantees to relieve emotional anxiety, the person ends up creating tension. This constant search for reassurance exhausts the relationship for both the one who feels it and the one who tries to respond. Emotional self-sabotage is also born from this pattern. The person longs for stable love, reciprocity, and permanence, yet reacts as if love were a threat. Sometimes they get too close. Other times, they withdraw quickly, afraid of depending. Sometimes they demand presence. Other times, they push affection away because they don't believe they deserve it. Maté explains that this is a direct reflection of the feeling of inadequacy. The person loves, but fears being loved. Bowlby described that fragile childhood bonds created adults who doubted their worth to others. Thus, a simple delay becomes insecurity. A shift in mood becomes confirmation of abandonment, and the person believes the problem is themselves. Deep down, someone living this dynamic wants something very simple: to love without fear, to feel safe enough, to trust that the other person won't disappear, to receive affection without having to prove value all the time. The person seeks stable love, but carries an inner child who learned to expect rejection. And when they begin to see how emotional insecurity shapes every gesture, every misinterpretation, every self-protective reaction, an inevitable question appears. If insecurity affects relationships this much, what does it do to everyday life, where decisions, opportunities, and dreams also depend on internal confidence? Emotional insecurity is not limited to relationships. It begins to infiltrate daily decisions, simple choices, and even the dreams someone tries to build. Gabor Maté explains that when someone grows up believing that making mistakes is dangerous, every step becomes a possible risk. The person hesitates before acting, overthinks before trying something new, and often freezes in front of opportunities that could change their life. It's as if the body were saying, "Be careful, you might not be enough." And this constant warning makes even basic actions harder, turning daily life into an emotional minefield. This insecurity also fuels procrastination, not because of laziness, but because of fear of failure. The person delays projects, avoids important conversations, postpones simple decisions because they fear judgment. Maté explains that when the feeling of inadequacy dominates, the brain seeks safety in inertia. It is safer not to try than to face the possibility of rejection. Bowlby reminded us that children without consistent support learn to doubt their own abilities. In adulthood, this shows up as excessive self-criticism, emotional perfectionism, and fear of exposure. Constant comparison also consumes energy that could be used to grow. The person looks around and believes everyone is moving forward while they remain stuck. This intensifies low self-esteem and emotional anxiety, creating a cycle that is hard to break. Instead of celebrating small victories, they criticize themselves for not being like others. Maté explains that the mind, guided by childhood wounds, only sees what confirms the feeling of insufficiency. And so, the person begins to measure their worth by impossible standards. Another major impact is the difficulty in setting boundaries. Those who grew up believing they needed to be pleasant to be accepted develop a fear of disappointing others. So they say yes when they want to say no, overload themselves to avoid seeming incapable, and hide fatigue to avoid worrying anyone. This behavior creates emotional exhaustion and strengthens the habit of self-sabotage. Bowlby observed that children who had to hide their needs, he learned to stay quiet, to preserve the bond. And this pattern persists. The adult stays silent to avoid conflict, but deep down feels unseen. In the end, someone who lives this way doesn't want to be perfect. They want to be free. Free from the fear of making mistakes. Free from the fear of being seen. Free from the fear of showing imperfection. Free from the constant sense of owing something to the world. Free from the emotional insecurity that blocks even simple actions. And when this person begins to see how this pattern affects their routine, their decisions, and even their dreams, an inevitable question arises. If all of this comes from such a deep root, what is truly hiding behind the insecurity they've carried their whole life? Emotional insecurity almost never comes from what the person imagines. It does not arise from a flaw, a character defect, or a lack of strength. Gabor Maté explains that behind insecurity, there is almost always an original wound, a moment when the child had to choose between being who they were or keeping the affection of someone important. And in the attempt to preserve the bond, the child learned to doubt themselves. That doubt, repeated silently for years, becomes a feeling of insufficiency. The person grows up believing they must earn what should have been given naturally. This wound doesn't always come from big traumas. It often arises from small but repeated absences. An adult who was too busy, a compliment that never came, affection that depended on the caregiver's mood. Maté notes that the child interprets these failures as their own fault because they cannot imagine that the problem might be in the other person. And this is how internalized shame emerges, a feeling that something in me is not good enough. John Bowlby noted that this type of experience left the child without a safe inner place. In adulthood, this becomes anxious attachment, constant comparison, and persistent fear of abandonment. Behind this insecurity, there is also the inner child, who tried, alone, to understand why receiving love seemed so difficult. It is this child who still asks, "Will anyone ever truly choose me?" It is this child who fears rejection, who worries about pleasing others, who tries to predict people's moods to avoid being hurt. Maté explains that this child internalizes a rigid rule. If I show who I am, I may lose affection. So the adult repeats the same script, trying to control everything to avoid reliving the old pain. But this attempt at control creates emotional self-sabotage because no one can maintain a flawless version of themselves every single day. Another element hidden behind insecurity is conditional love. A person who received affection only when meeting expectations grows up believing they must shape themselves to be accepted. This generates emotional perfectionism, fear of making mistakes, and a constant search for validation. Bowlby observed that without consistent models of affection, the child developed difficulty trusting, and this difficulty follows the adult as a distorted lens. Constant comparison, fear of rejection, and emotional anxiety are simply modern expressions of an ancient survival mechanism. But behind all of this lies a deep desire, authenticity, the desire to exist without having to adapt in order to be accepted, the desire to be chosen, not for performance, but for truth, the desire to abandon that old feeling of insufficiency, built over time, as the child tried to understand why affection seemed so difficult. Maté explains that when someone sees the root of this pain, something inside begins to reorganize. And from this recognition comes the chance to build inner security. From there, an inevitable question arises: how to turn all of this into practice, how to create bonds that do not depend on fear, but on emotional freedom? Breaking the pattern of emotional insecurity does not begin with strength. It begins with awareness. Gabor Maté explains that healing starts when a person recognizes that their fear is not something from adult life, but an echo of old wounds. This recognition does not solve everything instantly, but it creates space to see one's internal movements more clearly. It is as if the person finally understood that they are not reacting to the present. They are reacting to what the body learned before they even had language to express it. And when this becomes evident, a real possibility for change emerges. One of the first steps is learning to name what you feel, something simple, yet deeply transformative. Maté notes that when emotions have no name, they act on their own. But when a person can say, "This is fear of abandonment. This is a feeling of insufficiency. This is my anxious attachment speaking," they regain part of their control. This practice requires gentleness, not pressure. Bowlby observed that children whose emotions were validated learned to trust their perceptions. In adulthood, this learning can be rebuilt, identifying, validating, breathing, and responding differently. Another essential movement is developing emotional self-regulation. It's not about becoming immune to fear, but creating an inner space between what you feel and what you do. This can happen through simple practices, unhurried walks, reflective writing, deeper breathing, honest conversations with trusted people. The idea is not to fix everything, but to teach the body, not to react as if it were always in danger. Maté explains that the emotional system can be retrained with consistency and patience. Small daily practices help rebuild this path. It is also important to revisit the origin of boundaries. Those who grew up trying to please tend to say yes while bleeding on the inside. Breaking this cycle requires courage to establish new boundaries, saying no without guilt, asking for space when necessary, communicating discomfort before it becomes resentment. Bowlby described that secure bonds were formed when there was predictability and mutual respect. In adult life, this translates into relationships where a person can exist without fear of losing affection, simply for expressing what they feel. And this freedom is an essential part of healing. At its core, breaking this emotional pattern is about recovering inner worth. It is about no longer seeing yourself as someone hard to love. It is realizing that emotional insecurity does not define character. It simply reveals wounds that were never properly cared for. Maté highlights that when someone starts acting from emotional authenticity instead of fear, the body learns a new path. And this seemingly subtle shift is what allows deeper bonds, more stable relationships, and a life where love is no longer a threat, but freedom. Now that you've made it this far, you may have realized something important. Emotional insecurity was never a flaw. It was an old request for care, a request no one heard at the right time. But today, you finally saw what had been guiding you without your awareness. And understanding this opens an entirely new path, because for the first time, you're not just feeling, you're understanding. And understanding is the kind of strength that changes entire destinies. But I want to ask you a question, and it's essential for what happens from here on. In which part of your life does insecurity limit you the most today? In relationships, in choices, at work, or in the way you see yourself? Write it here in the comments. And along with that, tell me which city and country you're watching from. I want to know how far this conversation is reaching. And if this content made sense to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming content. And if you want to continue this journey, in the comments, there are materials that go deeper into these themes, guides, reflections, and practices that help you understand yourself better. And before we finish, I want you to carry just one truth with you and guard it as something precious. You are not the fear you feel. You are everything that will awaken the moment you stop running from yourself. You are the quiet child. Insecurity tells the story of this child who tried to survive, and healing begins when you finally listen to what they have to say.